The check printer in the corner had jammed sometime around 4 in the morning, and nobody had bothered to fix it, which was how Rosalind Vance knew the company was already dead. You stop maintaining a thing once you've decided to bury it. She sat at the head of the long walnut table on the 52nd floor of the Meridian Tower, a building that bore her family's name in brushed steel over the King Street entrance, and she looked at the document in front of her the way you'd look at an X-ray of your own chest. 311 pages. A filing for protection under the company's Creditors Arrangement Act, prepared with surgical neatness by the restructuring partners at Hargrave and Finch, who billed in 6-minute increments and had not once, in 11 days, called her by her first name. Outside, the freezing rain came sideways off the lake. February in Toronto had a particular cruelty to it, a gray that got into the bones, and the storm threw itself against the floor-to-ceiling glass, while 41 stories below, the gardener crawled with red taillights. Somewhere down there were the people who didn't know yet. The line workers in Thunder Bay, the crews on the James Bay transmission corridor, the dispatchers in Calgary. 11,000 people who would wake up tomorrow employed by a corpse. Rosalind was 39 years old, and until about 8 months ago she had been, by most reckonings, the most successful person her grandfather had ever produced. He'd built Meridian Power and Holdings out of a single hydro concession on the Ottawa River in 1961, and he'd handed it to her instead of her uncle's because, he said, she was the only one who could read a balance sheet without lying to herself. She'd taken a regional utility and turned it into a continental energy platform, wind in Saskatchewan, gas peakers in Alberta, hydro across the Shield. The Globe and Mail had put her on a cover. Now the same paper had a draft obituary, she was sure of it, sitting in a folder, waiting. "You're doing the right thing." The voice belonged to Gordon Ashcroft, her chief financial officer, and it slid across the table like something poured. Gordon was 61, silver at the temples, the kind of man who wore a pocket square to a funeral and made it look correct. He had been her grandfather's protege before she was born. He'd held her hand through her first proxy fight. "There's no shame in it, Roz. A perfect storm. The carbon levy shift, the rate freeze in Alberta, the European offtake collapsing. No board in the country would have seen it coming." "$1.4 billion," she said. Her voice came out flat and far away, like it belonged to someone in the next room. "How does $1.5 billion of working capital just evaporate, Gordon? We had a clean audit. KPMG signed it in October. Unqualified. Consolidation lag." He said it gently, the way you'd explain death to a child. The Prairie subsidiaries were papering over their numbers to hit their targets. By the time it reached the consolidated statements, the bleeding was past the artery. He patted her forearm. His hand was warm and dry. "It's nobody's fault. It's the system." She had known Gordon Ashcroft for 30 years, and she had never once seen his eyes do what they did just then, a small flicker, a brightness that came and went too quickly to name. She filed it somewhere below the exhaustion. She hadn't slept in 3 nights. Coffee from the machine down the hall, 4 cups, then 6, then she stopped counting, and her hands had a fine tremor in them now that wouldn't settle. Across from Gordon sat Bram Caudill, the lead restructuring lawyer from Hargrave and Finch, a younger man with a haircut that cost more than most people's rent and the warmth of a parking meter. "Mrs. Vance," he said, tapping the face of his watch, "the stay application is filed electronically with the court at the open of business. The monitor's affidavit is ready. If we don't execute before the TSX opens, your secured lenders trigger default acceleration, and we lose the chance to do this in an orderly way. Scotiabank and RBC have both signaled they will not extend the standstill past 9 o'clock. I need your signature, and I need it now." She picked up the pen. It was her grandfather's pen, a heavy black thing with a gold nib, the one she'd watched him sign 40 years of deals with. She uncapped it. She set the nib to the line marked Chief Executive Officer, Meridian Power and Holdings, Inc., and she let the silence settle over the room, broken only by the hum of the building's heat reclaim system and the wet drag of a mop somewhere behind her, where the cleaning crew was finishing the night. "Don't." The word landed in the room like a dropped glass. It had come from the far corner, near the recycling bins and the catering carts the executives had left behind. Bram Caudill's head snapped around. Gordon went very still, and Rosalind, the gold nib a millimeter above the paper, turned in her chair. The man standing there was holding a yellow microfiber cloth and a bottle of glass cleaner. He wore the slate-colored coveralls of Greenspan Building Services, the third-party crew that did the towers along the financial district after hours. He was maybe 45, lean in a way that wasn't healthy, with 3 days of gray stubble and the deep, bruised hollows under his eyes of a man who hadn't had a full night's sleep in a very long time. A laminated badge on a lanyard said his name was Owen. For a moment, nobody spoke. The man looked as shocked as anyone that the word had left his mouth. "Get out," Caudle said, recovering first, his voice cracking like a whip. "This is a confidential legal proceeding. You're not authorized to be in this room. I'll have security up here in 30 seconds. "Owen, is it?" Gordon stood, and his paternal warmth was suddenly gone, replaced by something harder. He moved toward the table console where the security desk could be paged. "Son, I don't know what you think you heard, but you are about to lose your job and possibly a great deal more. This is private." "Stop." Rosalind didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. It was the voice that had held a room of utility regulators silent for an hour, and Gordon's hand froze above the intercom. Caudle closed his mouth. She looked at the man in the corner. She did not look at the coveralls or the cleaning cart or the cloth in his hand. She looked at his face, at the exhaustion that mirrored her own, and underneath it, sharp and unmistakable, an intelligence that did not match the uniform. "What did you say?" The man swallowed. He set the bottle down on the cart with a care that seemed almost ridiculous in that room of marble and money. "I said don't sign it. You're working from a number that's wrong." He glanced at the glass wall behind her, the smart panel that had been left on, glowing with the master ledger the executives had been arguing over half the night. "There's at least $400 million on that wall that doesn't exist. And once you sign that filing, nobody's going to look for it. They're just going to sell your company for parts." Gordon laughed, short and ugly. "Roz, the janitor's an analyst now. This is absurd. The court is waiting." "What's your name?" she asked him. Just him. "Owen Tremblay." "And how does a man who cleans this floor know what's on that wall, Mr. Tremblay?" He looked down at his boots for a second, scuffed steel toes flecked with road salt. Then he looked back up, and something in his posture changed, straightened, the way a man stands when he remembers he used to be someone. "Because 5 years ago, I was a forensic actuary at Deloitte. Energy and insurance practice. I spent 11 years building risk models for outfits exactly like yours. I read financial statements the way you read a menu." He nodded at the wall. "And whoever built that one made a mistake any first year would catch, if they were looking. The problem is nobody in this room was looking. You were all too busy planning the funeral." The room had gone so quiet she could hear the rain. She should have called security. Any other night, any other life, she would have. But she was a woman who had built an empire on the conviction that the math did not lie, that if the numbers said something impossible, then somebody had lied to the numbers. And for 8 months, a small, starved voice in the back of her mind had been whispering that exactly that had happened, that there was no perfect storm, that storms don't take $1.5 billion and leave the building standing. "You have 2 minutes, she said. "Show me." Owen Tremblay had not meant to say a word. He had told himself this over and over for the last 20 minutes, while he stood in the corner pretending to organize the recycling and listened to a billionaire's voice come apart. He'd clocked in at 10 the night before. His shift ran until 6, but his supervisor had texted at 11 saying the 52nd floor boardroom had to be spotless for a 7 a.m. meeting, no exceptions, or it came out of his pay, and Owen could not afford for anything to come out of his pay. Not this month. Not with the deposit for Boston due on the 14th. He had a son named Felix, who was 6, and who had been born with a heart that was put together slightly wrong, a rare malformation with a long name that Owen could now spell in his sleep. The first 2 surgeries had been here at Sick Kids on University Avenue, and the country had paid for them, every cent, the way it was supposed to. Owen had stood in those bright hallways and felt, for the first time, that he lived in a place that would catch you. But the 3rd surgery, the one Felix needed now, the one that would actually let him grow up, was a procedure that nobody in Canada had done enough times to do safely on a child this small. The team that did it was in Boston, and Boston did not take OHIP, and the province had denied the out-of-country funding request twice, on the grounds that the surgery was still classified as experimental. So the number on the page from Boston Children's was $410,000, and it might as well have been 410 million. Owen's wife, Annette, had been a teacher. She'd died 2.5 years ago, an aneurysm, no warning, gone before the ambulance reached the house, and after that everything Owen had built came apart at a speed that still left him dizzy to remember. He'd missed too many days at Deloitte, sitting in waiting rooms, sitting in the dark of Felix's room, listening to the boy breathe. They'd been kind about it for a while, then they'd been less kind. Then there had been a restructuring of his own, and he'd been let go with a package that lasted exactly as long as packages last, which is to say, not long enough. He sold the house in Leaside. He moved them into a basement apartment in the East End where the radiator banged all night and the landlord pretended not to hear about the mold. And he took the only work that let him be home with Felix during the days, between the appointments and the school he could barely attend, which was cleaning the glass towers of people who would never once look him in the eye. He'd had a number in his head for 2 years now, a single brutal figure, how much of his old life he'd have to claw back, dollar by dollar, to give his son a chance at growing up. He was a man who understood probability better than almost anyone alive, and the probability was not good. At 6:15 that morning, wiping down the smart glass wall that the executives used as a screen, he'd paused. They'd left the master ledger up. To the rest of the crew, it was a wall of glowing numbers, boring as a hydro bill. To Owen, it was a sentence in a language he'd been fluent in since he was 22. His eyes had snagged on a heading near the bottom, Western Generation, Fuel and Dispatch, Athabasca Cluster. A column of natural gas fuel charges for the company's fleet of gas peaker plants in Alberta, the fast start turbines that fired up when demand spiked. The numbers were enormous, close to 400 million over 3 quarters, a huge slice of the deficit they kept blaming on fuel prices. But Owen's eye had drifted one column over to the operational status log, and the hair on his arms had stood up. You don't burn natural gas in a turbine that's sitting in pieces on a maintenance floor. He'd pulled the crumpled notepad from his back pocket, the one where he tracked Felix's medication times, and he'd done the arithmetic in his head, scratching figures in the margin. Unit GT7, fuel charge of 11 million for the 3rd quarter. Status, 3rd quarter, pulled offline for a hot gas path overhaul in Medicine Hat, rotor shipped out. Unit GT11, 9.4 million in fuel. Status, cold standby, decommissioned pending license review. Unit after unit. Of the 16 turbines in the Athabasca cluster, 11 had been dark for most of the year, idle, parked, some of them physically disassembled, and every single one of them was billing maximum fuel consumption as if it were running flat out. And the money wasn't going to a gas marketer. It wasn't going to anyone he recognized. Every dollar of it routed to a vendor called Athabasca Grid Services Limited, which he had never heard of, which sounded like nothing, which had the bland, nothing name of a company that exists only to receive money and pass it somewhere darker. It wasn't a storm, it was a siphon. Somebody inside the building had been writing checks for fuel that was never burned and funneling the cash out the back, and they'd done it on a scale that would bring the whole company down to cover the theft. He'd known, standing there with a cloth in his hand, that the smart thing was to leave. If they caught a cleaner reading their books, he wouldn't just be fired, he could be charged. He needed this job. He needed the benefits, thin as they were. He'd wiped his smudge off the glass and turned for the door. And then the oak doors had opened and they'd all walked in, and he'd been trapped in the corner, and he'd had to stand there and listen to a woman with a dead-looking face ask how $1 billion could vanish, while the silver-haired man beside her told her it was nobody's fault. It was the system. It was just one of those things. Owen had heard that exact voice before. A billing clerk at a hospital had used it on him once, explaining why his son's life was a line item that had been denied. It was the voice powerful people used when they wanted you to accept the unacceptable quietly. His son's face had come into his head. The way Felix held his breath climbing the basement stairs because the climb cost him too much. And before the part of Owen's brain that calculated risk could finish its work, his conscience had reached past it and opened his mouth. Now he was crossing the boardroom, past the lawyer who looked at him like he was something tracked in on a boot, and he picked a dry erase marker off the ledge of the glass wall, and his hand was not quite steady. Your CFO told you the deficit came from fuel prices and from your prairie subsidiaries hiding their losses, Owen said. That's not what happened. He drew a circle around the Athabasca heading. This is your gas speaker fuel cost for the cluster east of Medicine Hat, 16 turbines. The total charge over 3 quarters is about $390 million. Gas prices spiked, Cadil cut in, impatient. Everyone knows this. It's in the monitor's report. Gas is expensive, Owen agreed. But it only costs money when you actually burn it. He tapped the screen and pulled up the parallel operations log, the one the executives had left running beside the ledger. and he drew a hard red line connecting one turbine's fuel charge to its status field. Unit GT7 billed $11 million in fuel for the third quarter. According to your own maintenance log, GT7 spent that entire quarter torn down for an overhaul in Medicine Hat. The rotor was on a flatbed in Lethbridge. It didn't burn a cubic meter of gas. The room had gone the kind of quiet that has weight. He didn't stop. He drew another line. Unit GT11, $9.4 million in fuel. Status, decommissioned, cold standby. Unit GT4, $8 million, offline for a generator rewind. His voice had slipped, without his noticing, into the smooth cadence of a man who had stood in front of 100 boardrooms in another life. 11 of your 16 turbines were dark for most of the year, and every one of them is billing fuel like it's running at peak. Now look where the money goes. He highlighted the vendor field, not to a gas marketer. Every cent of it, $390 million, paid to this. Athabasca Grid Services Limited. Rosalind Vance had risen from her chair. The CCAA filing slid off her lap and fanned across the floor, and she didn't notice. She walked to the glass, and her eyes moved between the fuel charges and the maintenance log, back and forth, and Owen watched the thing happen that he had seen happen to clients before. The moment the impossible becomes obvious, the moment a person realizes it was never hidden well, it was only hidden by someone who controlled both sets of books and signed off on the audit. She turned her head slowly and looked at Gordon Ashcroft. The warmth and the panic had drained out of her face entirely. What was left was a cold so complete it seemed to drop the temperature of the room. Gordon, just the name. What is Athabasca Grid Services? The silver-haired man had gone the color of paper. His hands found the edge of the table and gripped it. Roz, it's a balancing services intermediary, a routing entity. The status log is obviously corrupted. It's a data integrity issue out of the Calgary office. A glitch. A $400 million glitch, Owen said quietly. On turbines that are sitting in pieces. He looked at Rosalind. I ran the corporate registry on my phone while I was supposed to be emptying the bins. Athabasca Grid Services isn't an energy company. It's a numbered holding incorporated in the Cayman Islands 14 months ago. Right about when your cash flow problem started. Shut your mouth, Gordon snarled, and the practiced warmth was gone now, every trace of it, and what stood there was an old man caught. You're a cleaner. You don't know what you're looking at. Bram, Rosalind didn't take her eyes off her CFO. The lawyer straightened. Ms. Vance? Call the Ontario Securities Commission, then call the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, then call the court and pull the filing. We are not signing anything today. Rosalind, please. Gordon stepped toward her with his hands raised, and his voice cracked into something pleading. Let's talk privately. We can manage this. Think about what you're doing. If you take one more step toward me, Gordon, she said, in a voice as level as a frozen lake and twice as cold, I will throw you through that window myself, and I will tell the police it was the storm. He stopped. She turned back to Owen, and for a long moment the billionaire and the cleaner stood across the wreckage of the morning and simply looked at each other. Her breathing was uneven. He could see her doing the arithmetic of her own near disaster, how close she'd come, the nib a millimeter off the page. You said you were an actuary, she said, at Deloitte. For 11 years. Then why, she said, and her eyes went over the coveralls, the cart, the cloth, are you cleaning my building at 4 a.m? He'd been asked the question before by people who wanted the short version so they could stop thinking about him. He gave her the true one anyway because she'd asked it like she actually wanted the answer. My son, Felix, he was born with a heart defect. He's had 2 surgeries here, and the country covered them, and I'll never stop being grateful for that. But the third one, the one that lets him grow up, they only do it in Boston, and the province won't pay for it because it's still called experimental. I lost my wife. Then I missed too much work and lost my job, and the insurance went with it. I clean offices at night so I can take my son to his appointments during the day. He looked at the marker still in his hand and set it down. That's the number I've been doing arithmetic on for 2 years. It just so happens I'm good at it. Rosalind Vance looked at him for what felt like a long time. Then she bent, picked the 311 pages of her company's death certificate up off the floor, squared them once against the table out of pure reflex, and tore them down the middle. Mr. Tremblay, she said, and the first real smile in 8 months broke across an exhausted face, I don't think you'll be cleaning floors much longer. What happened over the next several days had the quality of a thing slipping rapidly downhill. Security took Gordon Ashcroft down to a holding office on a lower floor, where he sat under the eyes of two corporate guards and demanded a lawyer and got one, and said nothing useful. The OSA opened a file before noon. By the time the markets closed, Meridian stock had cratered on rumors that the CEO had pulled an insolvency filing at the last minute, and half of Bay Street had decided Rosalind Vance had lost her nerve, or her mind. She gave Owen Tremblay a corner office on the 50th floor, 3 workstations, and unrestricted access to the company's servers, and she paid him a sum to begin with that he had read twice and then sat down for. It wasn't charity, she'd told him, and she'd refused to discuss it. It was a signing bonus, and it would not begin to cover what he was worth. She needed a chief risk officer who understood how desperate men hid money, and her $4 million audit firm had walked past this for a year. He didn't sleep. He drank the office coffee, which was somehow worse than the burnt stuff at Greenspan, and he hunted. He went past the laundered internal reports and into the raw payment rails, the wire codes, the swift traffic. The money that flowed into Athabasca Grid Services didn't sit still in the Caymans. It fractured the instant it landed, broken into hundreds of smaller transfers, bounced through shells in Cyprus and the Channel Islands and Belize, a structuring technique meant to defeat the automated flags at Fintrack and every other reporting agency. It was clever. It was the work of someone with real resources, not a CFO with a grudge. But Owen Tremblay was not an algorithm. He was a man who had spent his whole working life on one idea, that scattered money always has to come home to whoever it belongs to, that the convergence point is the one thing the launderer cannot hide forever. On the evening of the 4th day, with a bruised pink dusk settling over the half-frozen lake, he walked into Rosalind's office without knocking and dropped a thick black binder on her desk. She was on the phone with a Crown prosecutor and looked like she hadn't slept either. She held up one finger, finished the call, set the phone down. "Tell me you found something." He had. 70% of the money, scattered through 14 jurisdictions, eventually reconsolidated into a single private wealth account at a bank in Geneva. He'd cross-referenced the routing of that account against corporate dividend records, and at the bottom of it, the sole beneficial owner of the holding that controlled the Geneva account was a name. She read it and the blood went out of her face. It was the chairman of Cascade Continental Power, Meridian's largest and most aggressive rival. The man who had spent 6 years trying to buy her out and had never forgiven her for outbidding him on the James Bay corridor. A ruthless old-school energy magnate named Victor Sloan. "It was never embezzlement," she said softly, and her voice had a new note in it, something low and dangerous. "Or not only, it was a takeover, from the inside." "Sloan paid Ashcroft to invent the deficit," Owen said. "They drained your liquidity to force you into CCAA. Once you'd filed, the court would supervise a sale, and Cascade was perfectly positioned to buy your generation fleet for pennies at the restructuring. Sloan keeps your assets. Ashcroft keeps $50 million in the islands. You disappear." She stood and went to the window and looked out at the city she'd nearly handed over, her reflection laid over the lights. She'd been played by the men she trusted most, steered to the edge of a cliff by a rival who'd decided she was a woman young enough to push. She felt the sting behind her eyes, but it had nothing of grief in it this time. It was rage, clean and total. "Can we prove it in court?" "We have the digital trail," Owen said. "But Sloan has the best lawyers in the country. They'll say the Geneva account is a blind trust, that he had no knowledge of what Ashcroft routed through the Caymans. To freeze his assets and claw your $400 million back, we need a confession. We need Gordon to turn on him." He paused. "And right now, Gordon's sitting in a cell believing Sloan is going to protect him." Rosalind turned from the window, and the look on her face would have frightened anyone who'd ever crossed her. "Then we should go and explain to Gordon," she said, "that Sloan is about to feed him to the wolves. Get your coat, Mr. Tremblay. It's snowing." The detention center on the edge of the city was a low concrete fortress lit by fluorescent tubes, and Gordon Ashcroft, in a gray institutional sweatsuit instead of his bespoke wool, looked 20 years older than he had 4 days before. When the steel door opened and he saw Rosalind walk in, followed by the man he'd called a janitor, his face curdled. "You shouldn't be here, Roz. My counsel will have a field day." "This is my new chief risk officer," she said, sitting down across the bolted table. "And I'm here because I'm the last person on Earth who can keep you out of a federal penitentiary for the rest of your life." "I'm not saying a word." He folded his arms. Owen set a single sheet of paper on the table between them. A printed copy of an encrypted message recovered from a deleted archive on Ashcroft's company laptop, the metadata intact. He didn't say anything, he just let the old man read it. We mapped all of it, Owen said quietly. Athabasca to Cyprus to the account in Geneva that belongs to Victor Sloan. The RCMP has the warrants drafted. He laid down a second sheet, and this went out on the wire 40 minutes ago. It was a statement from Cascade Continental Power. It denied any involvement in irregularities at Meridian, and it expressed shock to learn that its systems may have been compromised by a rogue financial contractor. "He's burning you, Gordon," Rosalind said, almost gently. "He's going to tell the world you hacked his accounts to hide what you stole from me. You take the fall for the whole $1.5 billion. He walks onto his plane, and you die in here." Gordon Ashcroft looked at the 2 pages for a long time. Then his shoulders, which had held 30 years of careful posture, came down, and a sound came out of him that was almost a sob. He had played at thrones with men richer and crueler than himself, and he'd been spent like a chip. "What do you want?" he said. "Everything," Rosalind answered. "The encryption keys. Every meeting, every wire, every dollar. You hand me Victor Sloan, and I'll ask the Crown to recommend you serve your time somewhere with a library. You refuse, and I'll make sure they bury you so deep your own lawyer can't find you." He gave them everything. 3 days later, the RCMP, working with their American counterparts, arrested Victor Sloan on the tarmac at Pearson as he tried to board a private jet bound for a country with no extradition treaty. The digital trail Owen had built, paired with Gordon Ashcroft's testimony, made an unanswerable case. The courts froze Sloan's assets, including the $390 million that had been bled out of Meridian, and the money came home inside of a week. Rosalind called an emergency board meeting in the same room where, 11 days earlier, those same directors had urged her to surrender. They looked at her now with a wariness that bordered on fear. "The deficit is gone," she told them, in a voice that left no room. "The fleet is whole. Our lenders have restored the credit lines. Cascade Continental is in receivership, and I have instructed our team to prepare a bid for their Western assets. We are not dying. We are going hunting." She let the silence sit. "And there's one more thing." She turned toward the back of the room, and a man walked forward who was no longer wearing slate coveralls. Owen Tremblay had on a charcoal suit that actually fit him, and he carried a leather folio, and he stood straight in a way he hadn't in years. "This is Owen Tremblay," she said, "our new chief risk officer. He found the number none of you saw. Without him, there is no company for any of us to sit in. His word carries mine. When he tells you a figure is wrong, you will listen." The directors, several of whom had walked past this man for years without seeing him, rose and shook his hand. A little under a year later, on a bright cold afternoon with the snow finally gone and the first real warmth coming off the lake, Owen Tremblay sat in a waiting room at Boston Children's Hospital and watched the most ordinary, impossible thing he had ever seen. His son was running. Felix was 6.5, still small, his hair grown back soft and fine, and he ran the length of the bright corridor and back without stopping once to catch a breath he didn't have. The repair had held. The cardiologist had used the word cured, carefully, the way good doctors use it, but he'd used it. The boy ran the way a thing runs when it has finally been built right. Rosalind Vance sat in the chair beside Owen, in jeans and a wool sweater that cost no more than anyone's, holding a foil balloon shaped like a sailboat. She'd flown down for the follow-up, the way she'd flown down for the surgery, on a commercial flight, in the back, because she'd said it would feel obscene to do otherwise. She watched Felix tackle a nurse with a hug that nearly knocked them both over. "He's got an engine on him," she said. "He's a fighter." Owen's voice came out thick. He looked at the woman beside him, the one who'd nearly signed her family's legacy away in a snowstorm, who had become, somewhere in the chaos of that year, the closest thing he had left to family of his own. "I don't know how to thank you. I've given up trying to find the words." "You don't owe me anything, Owen." Her eyes stayed on the boy. "You saved my life's work. I just made sure you got to keep yours." He looked at his watch, a good one now, and realized he didn't have a shift tonight. He didn't have to hide from anyone's calls. All he had to do was take his healthy son back to a home with good heat and no mold, read him a story about pirates, and wake up in the morning to run the risk floor of a company worth billions, because a woman had bothered to look him in the eye when no one else would. Sometimes the world takes everything you have and leaves you holding a mop in the dark, and sometimes, in the worst hour of the worst night, you look at the wall of numbers everyone else has given up on, and you find the one they missed, and you take it all back. What I keep coming back to is how close Rosalind Vance came to signing, and how the only reason she didn't was that a man everyone in that tower had trained themselves not to see decided, in the worst hour of his own life, to open his mouth anyway. None of it happened by accident, and I think that's the part worth sitting with. Owen Tremblay caught what a $4 million audit firm walked past because 11 years of training never actually left him. The world took his job, his wife, and his house, but it couldn't take the way his mind worked, the way he still read a column of numbers and felt his stomach drop when one of them lied. That's the thing nobody can repossess. A sharp, well-kept mind keeps paying you back long after everything else is gone, and it pays you back exactly when you need it most. But being right wasn't enough, and I don't want to pretend it was. Plenty of people in that room could have done the arithmetic if they'd bothered. What set Owen apart was that he chose to speak when speaking could have cost him the one job standing between his son and the cold. He weighed it the way he weighed everything, and then he did the decent thing instead of the safe thing. That choice is the whole story. Cleverness without that backbone would have just walked out the door and let the billionaires bleed. It was the decency underneath the brains that actually saved 11,000 jobs, and, in the end, a little boy's heart. And then there's the part that gets less applause, the 2 years of clocking in at 10 at night to clean other people's glass towers, of hiding from collectors, of carrying a number in his head so heavy it should have crushed him. He didn't quit. He didn't let grief turn him bitter or small. When the door finally opened, he was ready to walk through it because he'd kept showing up through every reason not to. Felix is running down a hospital hallway today, breath he never used to have, because his dad refused to lie down. Rosalind had her own version of all three. She listened to a man in coveralls when every instinct and every lawyer told her not to, and that humility was its own kind of strength. After it was over, she didn't gloat, didn't fly private, didn't make a show of being saved. She just made sure the man who saved her got to keep his own life. So when I look at Owen and Rosalind, I don't see luck. I see a clear mind that stayed sharp in the dark, a conscience that spoke up when it was expensive to, and a stubborn refusal to give up on the people who needed them. Build those three things in yourself, quietly, for years, and you'll be ready the morning the door opens. Most people won't be.